Welcome to this presentation on creating communication boards to support language development during storybook interactions. In this presentation, we'll be talking about what typically takes place during storybook interactions with speaking children and how we can support those same types of interactions for children with complex communication needs who make use of augmentative and alternative communication. So the first thing that we're going to do is take a look at what happens during typical story interactions with speaking children. So please watch this short video clip of a teacher reading with a preschool classroom.
Jack's class goes to the zoo, and on the bus, Jack takes Ben's book. At the zoo, he grabs a banana from the gorilla's cage. Is that very nice? No! That is very naughty.
Yeah, I'm gonna go in there and punch him in the face.
No. Listen to the story. Then he steals a fish from the penguin's pond, and everyone says, That's not yours.
That is like Madagascar.
It does look like Madagascar. Now, Jack wants the ball in the sleeping lion's paw, and everyone screams, "Ah!" Would you go in a lion's cage? No way, Jose. They scare me just looking through the fence.
I don't want to go in there.
He might eat you. Look at the lion. Give that back, Jack. It's not yours.
Well, punch that lion.
No. Let's see what happens. Listen. But Jack runs away to the reptile house. There he spots Mac the python. Ah, thinks Jack, I'll have him for my pet. So he climbs the ladder into Mac's tank.
Hey, I have a fish tank.
Let's see what
We
happens.
have fishies.
So in that clip, you saw some of the things that children typically do during story interactions with an adult. They like to ask questions. They like to answer questions. They like to demonstrate their enjoyment of the text, sometimes by talking about how the story relates to their life experiences. And over time, as children become more familiar with the story, they like to retell the story and put the story in their own words. Participating in storybook reading activities does two very important things for children. First, it increases their motivation to learn to read. Because they see that reading is a fun and enjoyable activity, they become more interested in themselves in learning how to read. Second, as they participate in these storybook interactions, they're developing new language skills. So they're learning new vocabulary items, they're learning how words can be used to communicate ideas. They're also developing an understanding of story structure. So they're being exposed to lots and lots of models of how do we create a beginning, a middle, and an end in a story? How do we develop characters? How do we explain a plot to an audience? And this will be very helpful for children when it comes time for them to start writing their own stories. It would be hard to overestimate the importance of reading to young children and the impact that this has on their language and vocabulary growth. In this chart, you see the number of words that children are able to speak at different ages, and you see the explosion of language that takes place between ages 2 and 5. Roughly, children go from about using 200 words to using over 2,000 words. This is an increase sometimes of 2 to 3 words a day. What supports that growth is the exposure to language being used in a wide variety of ways, and the expectation that the child will use language to participate at these times. And storybook reading provides a wonderful opportunity for a child to be exposed to a very wide vocabulary and to have an opportunity to make use of that vocabulary to talk about what's going on in the story. I did want to emphasize, though, that we're interested in reading not only because of its importance for language skills, so for helping a child to understand and make use of new words, but also because it's a fun activity for children and increases their motivation to learn to read. Proof of this is that I bet a lot of you can remember stories that were read to you as a child. One of my personal favorites was Wump World by Bill Peet. But again, I'm sure all of you can remember stories that were read to you as a child. So just to get you thinking about what takes place during storybook interactions and how we can support those same types of interactions for children with complex communication needs, I'd like to start reading a short story to you, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the interactions that could take place during that story. The story is called Giraffes Can't Dance. Gerald was a tall giraffe whose neck was long and slim, but his knees were awfully crooked and his legs were rather thin. He was very good at standing still and munching shoots off trees. But when he tried to run around, he buckled at the knees. Now every year in Africa they hold the jungle dance, where every single animal turns up to skip and prance. And this year when the day arrived, poor Gerald felt so sad, because when it came to dancing, he was really very bad. The warthogs started waltzing, and the rhinos rocked and rolled. The lions danced a tango that was elegant and bold. Okay, so there was a couple things going on there. First, I was trying to model how I thought about the book, so I was doing my best to convey reading with an interested voice. And if I was reading with a young child, I'd probably point out some of the things I especially enjoyed about the stories or laugh about some of the pictures, really just trying to model the enjoyment that I find in reading a good book. The other thing I can model as I read a story like this with a child is how I build comprehension as I read. So I would make comments about the pictures, the story, the vocabulary, some of the things that were going on in the book. So, making comments like that giraffe looks very happy, or those lions really know some fancy dance steps. I can also model how I'm thinking about what's taking place in the story. So speaking aloud questions like, I wonder what will happen next. And I may also want to model answering these types of questions. So saying things like, I bet Gerald's going to try and dance at the competition this year. So when we think about the types of questions we can ask with children, there's really two main categories that come into play. First are factual or low-level questions in which we ask the child questions that can be answered with a simple factual knowledge of the story. So point to the lion, show me a tall tree, what color is the gorilla? Another type of question which requires a better understanding of the text is that we ask the child to make predictions and inferences. So we may ask them to make guesses as to what they think will happen next in the story. We may ask if there are things that go on in the story that are similar to things that have happened in their life. We may ask them to think about how they would feel if they were a character in the story. So just to provide some additional examples, if we were asking children to make predictions, we could talk to them about things like, what do you think will happen when Gerald dances? How do you think the other animals will react? How do you think Gerald will feel? We could talk to them about their experiences and some of the things that they would like to see take place in a story. So, what animal would you add to this story? How do you think they would dance? What kind of music do you like to dance to? We could also talk to the children about their feelings and how they relate to some of the things that take place in the story. So has there ever been a time when people made fun of something that you did? Has there ever been a time when you've tried something and been sad because it didn't work out? Or maybe more positively, has there ever been a time when you weren't sure if you could do something, you tried it and it worked out well? So again, trying to think about trying to think about questions related to the story and asking the children to talk about their experiences. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the rich interactions that take place when speaking children participate in storybook reading activities. Our central concern for this activity, though, is what happens in story reading activities with children who cannot speak. So what happens with children who, because of a physical or cognitive disability, so children with Down syndrome or children with autism or children with cerebral palsy, aren't able to make good use of spoken language. And our challenge is, how do we provide those children with the same opportunities to ask questions, answer questions, talk about how the story relates to their life experiences, and over time have a chance to retell stories in their own words so they can develop those language and communication skills. So what I'd like you to do now is watch a short video clip of an interaction between a child with Down syndrome and a paraprofessional or classroom aide who's reading a story with him, and think about how this interaction differs from what we typically see in storybook interactions.
Morning, Clifford set out to find us. He sniffed his way along the road. Clifford didn't mean to make trouble, but a lot of people had never seen a big red dog before. Clifford kept going. Nothing could stop him. And then he saw a little old man trying to fix his truck. The man needed help. So Clifford stopped and helped him. He took the little old man to a garage. The little old man gave Clifford a little lunch to thank him for his help. Nothing stopped him, not even wet cement. And traffic jams didn't stop him. Clifford just tiptoed over the cars, and then he came to a toll bridge. Clifford had no money, but that didn't stop him. We didn't know Clifford was coming. I found some new playmates, 2 baby bears. I was having so much fun, I didn't see Mama Bear. She didn't want strangers to play with her babies. She growled. I was in real trouble. Then we heard a louder growl. Guess who was growling? Mama Bear was surprised. She even forgot her babies. I told Clifford that the Mama Bear was only protecting her children. Good old Clifford. He took the baby bears back to Mama Bear, and then he took us all back to camp. Mommy and Daddy were surprised to see Clifford. I told them how Clifford saved my life, so they let Clifford stay with me.
So there are a lot of nice things going on there in some ways. The paraprofessional's chosen a good book. She's reading it in an interested tone of voice. She's not rushing through it, and she clearly has the child's attention, and he's following the story. However, there's a few things we'd probably want to address. So one of the things you probably noticed was that there was very limited participation by the boy with Down syndrome. So he really didn't have much of an opportunity there to answer questions, to comment, to participate in all the ways that help to build language and communication skills. So one of the things that we can do to help support language development at those times is to provide children with communication boards that will allow them to ask and answer questions and be involved in all the same rich interactions as children who can speak. And so the focus of the remainder of this presentation is going to be on how you can learn to create communication boards that will support language development during storybook interactions for children with complex communication needs. So let's talk about how we can create communication boards to support language development during story reading activities. And there's a series of 9 steps to be followed in developing and making use of communication boards during storybook reading activities. And I'm going to talk about each of these steps in a little more detail in the upcoming slides. The first step is to select a good book. So you want something that's got an interesting topic, so the child's going to want to interact about the topic, and you'll want something that's at an appropriate language level. So vocabulary that's a little bit ahead of where the child is at, and making use of language structures that is a little bit ahead of where the child is at. I'm sure you can remember from your childhood that often adults would read stories to you that you are not capable of reading independently. And ideally, stories contain a little bit of new information, but not so much new information that the child is overwhelmed. So if you think about Giraffes Can't Dance, probably the child was familiar with some of the creatures in the story, but the idea that these creatures would dance and also some new animals were introduced was a fun way of introducing some new ideas while still working with something that was familiar. And the child that we're going to be thinking about for the purposes of this activity is Ellie. Ellie is a 7-year-old girl in a regular first grade class. She has a diagnosis of cerebral palsy and communicates using a Dynavox, which is a speech generating device that has a number of pictures that she can use, and by selecting a picture, the device speaks a word. Like many kids her age, she loves Disney Channel, Hannah Montana, Minnie Mouse, and she's just a very socially engaged girl who loves to have fun with her friends. To get a better sense of Ellie, please click on the link to see a short clip of her reading and answering some questions about a short story. Then please click below the link on the following page to advance to the next slide. The next step is to think about what kind of vocabulary a young girl like Ellie would need to participate in a storybook interaction. So in making a list of vocabulary, we want to be thinking about what are some of the comments or questions that a child might want to make or ask as the story is read. And also we want to think about what are some of the questions that you as an adult or as a teacher might want to ask, and what are some of the answers to those questions. Ideally, we want to be in a position to be able to model the use of vocabulary as we speak with Ellie. So we're going to want to think about the questions that she might want to ask, as well as the questions that we might want to ask. In order to help with the identification and organization of this vocabulary, I'm going to ask that you make use of a shared reading communication board chart for your book. So what I'd like you to do as part of this activity is, for the story that you select, write out the characters, maybe some of the feelings or emotions that your characters are feeling, some of the actions or verbs that you will need to talk about your characters. You may also want to include some conjunctions, prepositions, articles so that you can form complete sentences as you model for the child. I'd like you to think about some of the questions you think the child might ask and actually write them out in the sample area and then think about the needed vocabulary for the asking of those questions. Also some of the comments. And then again for you as the adult or teacher, what are some of the questions that you might want to ask? What's some of the vocabulary that you need to represent the asking of those questions? And what's some of the vocabulary Ellie will need to answer those questions? Now, clearly if you listen to an interaction between a speaking child and a teacher or adult, there's an awful lot of words that go back and forth. So you're going to need to make some decisions about which is the highest priority vocabulary. So in the communication board that you're going to make for this activity, there's going to be a limited number of spaces. So clearly you're not going to be able to have 100, 200, 300 words in there. So think about some of the words that you could use most frequently. Think about some of the words that will be of greatest interest to the child and will be useful in a wide variety of situations. And I guess at the same time think about whether there's any specialized vocabulary that would really be needed for a particular story. So for example, with Gerald the giraffe, even though a word like giraffe isn't something that we're confident the child is going to be using 5 times a day for months at a time, it really is something that you need for this story. So you're going to be trying to balance off words that the child needs to talk about this particular story and words that you think would be useful for the child to learn to make use of in a wide variety of situations. So here's an example of how we might go about starting to fill out the SRCBC for Giraffes Can't Dance. So again, we're going to want to provide vocabulary so that the child can talk about the characters and where the story takes place and some of their emotions. And so again, even though words like zebra and alligator may not be something that are useful for over the next few years, some of those feelings words will be, and maybe some of those conjunctions will be. So we treat this as an opportunity both to add some vocabulary that's fun and work with vocabulary that you really need for the story, and to teach some words that will be used over a long period of time. And here you see that we've tried to write out some of the questions that the child might ask and some of the vocabulary they would need to ask those questions. And we've also tried to anticipate some of the comments that the child might make and some of the vocabulary that they would need to answer or to make those comments. We've also written out some of the questions that the teacher might ask and some of the vocabulary that would be needed to answer those questions. You'll notice that the needed vocabulary is a little bit different from the words that the teacher will use to ask a question. One of the reasons for that, as I mentioned, is we're going to be limited in space. So, as a teacher, you're probably going to use 400, 500, 600 different words in telling a story to a child. We can't provide all of those words to a child, so we need to make some decisions about what are some of the words that are most important to the story and what are some of the words that we want this child to learn to make use of over time. So again, there's no right or wrong answer to some of this. You'll just need to make some decisions about what is the vocabulary that you want to prioritize at this time. As we're starting to think about how we're going to organize our communication board, we may want to think about organizing it so that the nouns occur on the left, the verbs and the adjectives and prepositions occur in the middle, and then the questions are over to the right. In working in this way, we can help the child to create phrases. So moving from left to right, we can help the child create sentences. Okay, so at this stage we've selected a good book, we've made a list of the vocabulary that we want to use for that book, and in the folder you'll find additional instructions on how to make the communication board to be used with the story. I'm going to carry on and talk about what would actually happen once the communication board is made and how we would make use of that board in interacting with a child while reading a story. As with any child, one of the first things that we're going to do is introduce the book or introduce the topic. So we're going to look at the title of the story, look at the cover, talk a little bit about what this story might be about, maybe try and relate that topic to the child's experiences, maybe other books that they've read. Again, just trying to get them thinking about what are some of the things that might take place in this story. We may also want to teach some new vocabulary that will be useful for the child during this story. So if there's words that we know that are going to come up in this story that are going to be new to the child, and we don't want to sort of slow down the story at that point to introduce those words, we may want to talk a little bit about some of those words before we read the story. So maybe talking about some different kinds of music, or maybe talking about some of the animals that are going to come up in Giraffes Can't Dance, so that when those show up in the story, the child has an understanding of those vocabulary items. Next comes the actual reading of the story. So as you've noticed, when people read with children, they do their best to add inflection to their voice and pause and try and do things that are going to make it exciting for the child. Sometimes the first time through with a story, we ask a few questions, but we really want to give the child an opportunity to hear the story, have fun with the plot, and get to the ending. One of the nice things about reading with children is very often they want to hear the same story read over and over and over. So it's in those repeated readings that we really have more of an opportunity to ask the child questions, discuss the story, pause within the story to give the child a chance to participate. So again, during the first time through, we're going to ask a few questions and have a bit of fun with the book, but it's really in those repeated readings that we have additional opportunities to really get the child thinking and talking about the book. If you think back to that short video clip I showed at the beginning of the preschool teacher reading the story to the children, clearly that teacher had read that story to the children a number of times. They were reciting the lines of the characters. They were talking about what was going to happen next. So they were in a great position to know enough about the story to be able to ask and answer questions. As we're reading with the child, we're working to model the use of augmentative communication. So as we ask the child questions about the story, we're trying to make use of the child's augmentative communication device, or in your case, this communication board that we've made, so they can see their AAC system being used by others. So just as speaking children are surrounded by models of people speaking and using language to communicate, children who use augmentative communication need to see their AAC system being used by others as well, so they can get a better understanding of what those pictures represent and how the device can be used to communicate with others. This is challenging because, as I mentioned, as an adult reading a story, you're going to be using hundreds of words, and all of those words are not going to be immediately available to you on that communication board. So you're going to need to make some decisions about, which of the words are you going to model, and how are you going to model them so that you still have some appropriate syntax, but understanding that you're not going to have the opportunity to make use of the AAC device for every single word that you say. When the child does make use of their AAC device, clearly we want to respond to what the learner is saying and doing. So if they're asking questions, we want to answer those questions. When the learner makes a comment about the story, we want to respond to that and maybe try and expand it. So if the child says something like, looks at a picture of Gerald and says sad, we might want to model and say, yes, Gerald, and point to Gerald, is, and point to is, sad, and point to sad. So acknowledging what they're saying and just turning it into a complete phrase, perhaps. The other thing we're going to want to do, especially with repeated reading, so once we think the child's starting to get a better understanding of the story, is as we read through, pause from time to time to see if they'll make a comment, ask a question, make a prediction. Over time, we're going to want to ask the learner appropriate questions. Again, the first time through with a story, we really are probably going to focus on just helping the child to enjoy the plot and the characters in the story. Maybe ask a few questions, but really we want to focus on the story being most of all fun at that time. As we read the story over and over, we can start to introduce first some factual questions and then some higher order questions. I don't mean to imply that the first reading is the only time that's fun and the other readings we're bombarding them with questions. What's really interesting to think about is children love being successful at answering questions. So they're certainly going to enjoy the first time the story is read and answering a few questions at that time, but children really enjoy hearing a story read multiple times and being able to answer questions and being able to make predictions and see those predictions come true. And for those stories that really become favorites, we can encourage the learner to become the storyteller. So over repeated readings, we can have the learner retell the story. So when you turn to a new page, say, what's happening here, or what did Gerald say here, and encourage the child to retell the story in their own words. And again, this is a wonderful way for them to make use of and develop new language skills. When all of these pieces are in place, let's look at the positive things that can happen with an interaction. In this next video clip, you will see the paraprofessional making use of these strategies while reading a book about Clifford. She'll be using a speech generating device instead of a communication board, but the basic principles remain the same.
Last week,
Clifford
and I went to the
city.
to visit Clifford's brother, Nero.
Brother Nero.
Clifford knew the way. His
Brother Nero.
lives near a firehouse.
Firehouse.
He's a fire rescue dog.
Fire truck.
Where is the fire truck?
Yeah.
Right there, you're right. It's in the garage.
Yes.
In the firehouse.
Okay.
I asked the firefighters if
Clifford.
could help them. They thought he was the right color for the job. Just then, a group of
Children.
came in for a fire safety class.
Street.
Street. I don't see a street, but I think the fire truck is in the
Firehouse.
right.
Hose.
I think you're right. I see a
Hose.
up here.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a hose?
Yeah.
Yeah, it might be. I think the hose attaches to it.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Who?
Who are those guys?
Firefighters.
Yes, those are the firefighters.
Yeah.
And they're going to ride in the truck?
Yeah.
They're going to ride in the...
Fire truck. Siren. What?
What kind of a noise does a siren make? Very good. That's about right. That's what it sounds like.
So some very nice things happening there. As the paraprofessional reads the story, she models the use of the AAC device. She pauses at the end of each page to give the student an opportunity to ask questions or to comment. And when she does that, we see the student initiate communication, commenting on what's going on, and all of this creating some wonderful language development opportunities. It also looks like they're both having more fun when they interact in this way. I wanted to briefly share with you some of the research that's gone on in this area. Binger, Kent, Walsh, Ewing, and Taylor recently completed a study in which they worked with 3 paraeducators or classroom paraprofessionals to support communication during storybook readings. There were 3 children in this study, and basically what they did is teach the paraeducators to make use of the same strategies that you've learned here. What they found was that as a result of that instruction, all the paraeducators increased their use of communication strategies, as you've seen here during storybook reading, and all of the students increased their participation and communication during those activities. So please read the instructions for this assignment that are contained in the Angel folder. You'll need to select a book. You'll need to create a shared reading communication board chart, and then I'd also like you to follow the instructions to create a communication display using the software identified for this activity. Again, though, please refer to the assignment description on Angel for all of the activities that I'd like you to complete for this activity. Thank you.